Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again very much. We have this lovely opportunity to hear from Claire today. It's a very interesting presentation and another exciting topic for our webinar. And we hope that we will have some time in the end to demonstrate the practical community of practice that relates to this project. Before I introduce Claire, hello Claire, good to see you there. I would like to say a few things about the effort we're making in Mindsets, which is a new open community of practice that discusses information, digital and media literacy issues. The network is free to join. It is available via the wider One Higher Education Network. That is a global network for educators who share a passion for learning and teaching in higher education. Our network is free via that wider organization. We aim to engage different people in our group, educators, librarians, learning, teaching support professionals, and possibly policymakers as well in critical discussions and creative collaboration relating to students' lifelong development of information, digital and media literacy. We explore these issues that we haven't really examined in depth before, the transitions of the students into and out of higher education in relation to their everyday life experiences around digital media and information literacy. So what do they do in their everyday life environment? We really want to focus on synergy between those two different diverse key players. And we have an interest in digital inequalities as well. So we want to look into whether different socioeconomic differences, life situations, and other factors have an impact on the way in which students in higher education develop digital media and information literacy. So if you're an academic, librarian, learning, teaching support staff, or simply somebody who has interest for these areas, we'd like to hear from you, and would like to really hear from you in terms of you offering your ideas via webinars or discussions, chats, anything that you think may be valuable. This is a community for you. We have at the moment 84 subscribed members, and they're coming from different parts of the world. So we're happy to expand and make this more interactive. That's really the point. But I don't want to speak for too long. So today we have a very interesting topic on a community of practice for staff development and information literacy in a university. And our presenter is Clare Dean, who is an academic liaison librarian at York St. John University. Claire is working with the School of Education and the School of Humanities, Religion and Philosophy. So Claire today is presenting her results from her doctoral research in communities of practice within information literacy, the information literacy domain in higher education. And within that community of practice that she has developed, she has included already projects that are very interesting. For example, one is investigating reading lists for the representation of marginalized voices. And she's going to talk to you about also her cartoon self, which is very interesting. I'm very much into cartoons myself. That has been developed by Ollie Pike, if I hope I'm saying and pronouncing this correctly, who is the author behind this. It's all about inclusive education. So the webinar will give an overview of the research project at York St. John University, which is based on interviews and as well as a survey. The community of practice that I mentioned, the community of practice is for academic and professional staff. And it addresses actually traditional library skills, but also other aspects that have to do with how information literacy is socially constructed and how information literacy is critical. So Claire will tell you more about it. I don't want to monopolize this. Over to you, Claire, to hear more about your interesting work within the community of practice and your academic research in this area. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dina. Hi, everybody. I don't know if you can see my screen. I'll just say hello to you. If I can just share my video cam with you for a little bit. It's not coming up properly. Anyway, I am in the voice booth at York St John University, which is a little bit of a new experience for me. And let me just introduce a bit more about myself. As Dina said, I am an academic liaison librarian at York St John University, which is an ever-growing university, but still quite small in comparison to a lot of the places where a lot of my colleagues would work across the country. And I'm predominantly responsible for the School of Education and the School of Humanities, Religion and Philosophy. I've been doing the job with these schools for about 10 years now, and over that time there's been a lot of change, but there's also been some constants in there that I think need addressing. And from the beginning of my liaison job, I have been interested in how I can collaborate with both my academic colleagues and other colleagues across the university in further embedding information literacy into the curriculum. And by embedding, I mean actually designed into the curriculum rather than it being one-shot sessions and things like that. As Dina said, I am passionate about building more inclusive collections. I've with our school library collection just last year for our trainee teachers, but I'm really trying as well throughout the collections for which I'm responsible to make sure that marginalised voices become less so. So they're some of my interests, and this doctoral research that I'm going to talk about today has been ongoing for the past 5 years. So this is very much a potted history of this research, and it's been something I've been doing with Robert Gordon University, which is how I came to know Dina. I did this so that I had an external view on it. Ethically, I didn't want to be investigating the practice at my own institution and indeed my own practice without there being some sort of balance to it with an outside eye. So that's why I chose to do this project through a different university in the first place. Because this is 5 years of work, I really can't share absolutely everything that I've done in that time. And so necessarily for time's sake, there'll be bits I skip over and bits you might hope that I've gone into in more detail that I've not been able to. Please let me know if there's anything you'd like to know more about. I'll happily carry on this conversation via email or Twitter or on the phone. If there's anything more that you want to know about, please do let me know and we can carry on from there. So on with the project. Bit of the background to it. I very much came at this from the perspective of wanting to bring together all of the voices and all of the ideas and all of the people who are interested in information literacy across my university. Working in an academic liaison team, I think we were one of the few places where people came together who had a view on what was going on across the various schools or faculties that we had in place in the institution. And so as a team, we could tell that there were pockets of really good innovative practice going on, but no one was bringing anybody together to talk about it. So this is the starting point of where I wanted to investigate this more fully. What I wanted to do was sort of think about, well, for a start, what sort of information literacy, teaching, content, curriculum design actually going on. And then I wanted to be able to bring people together to discuss that, to see if we could learn from different subject areas and to see if that made embedding and designing information literacy into the curriculum more sustainable. Because goodness knows, there's only one of me for the schools I represent. And if I wanted to go and do all of the input I wanted to, then there wouldn't be enough time to do that. And I wanted it to be more sustainable than that. I didn't want to be tied to me as a person. Anything could happen. So I wanted it to be there for the long term. And this was one way maybe of investigating how we could go about doing this. So that's the background to where I started. About 9 years ago, I did our postgraduate certificate in academic practice here at York St John, and the research project that I did for that focused on building partnerships between librarians and academics and understanding each other's roles. So I'd already done a little bit of work on that, and there's been a couple of journal articles I have published on that topic in Library and Information Research and also the Journal of Information Literacy. So I can share those with anybody who's interested to see how we got to the stage where we are now. So my research objectives came out of my practice, and I wanted to understand the terminology, the meanings and the values that were assigned to information literacy across the different academic subject areas of our undergraduate programmes here at York St John. And I chose to focus on level 4, so year 1 of these undergraduate courses, because it's a key place for both students and staff to really make an impact and understand the transitions of where people have come from into the academic environment. And it gave me a nice sample size as well to work with. So looking at year 1, level 4 of the undergraduate programmes. And I felt I couldn't start to talk to my colleagues across the institution unless I understood how they expressed the values and the meanings and the skills linked to information literacy from their subject or professional perspective. So that's one of the objectives that I had. Moving on from that, I wanted to establish whether there was already evidence of the emerging forms of information literacy. Emerging forms, I mean theories that have been published in the last 10 years or so, specifically the social construction of information literacy, which is from Anne-Marie Lloyd, who talks about landscapes of information literacy, and also critical information literacy as theorized by Jim Elmborg. I'll go into that a little bit more in a couple of minutes' time. But I wanted to see if there was evidence of this already in the practice and teaching at York St John, as well as the more traditional information skills, library skills that you see in things like the Sconnell 7 Pillars. So that's where I was coming from. And if there was any shared practice, I wanted to see if that could be a foundation to grow these more progressive forms of information literacy in the curriculum. I wanted to understand how the academics experienced this and evaluated this in their teaching practices too, because I don't think this would work if it was me going in and impose my view of information literacy upon my colleagues. I have got a lot to learn from them, especially in terms of pedagogy and their programs and their subject practices. And I wanted this to be a truly community experience. So I wanted to think about how the academics experienced this. And from a result of all of this investigation, the final step is I wanted to implement and evaluate a platform for information literacy dialogue amongst the staff here at York St John. So both to promote the evolution of collaborative information literacy provisions with these learning theories and to improve my own practice. I've got a huge amount to learn going forward with this. So I wanted to improve my own practice as well. And throughout this presentation, you'll hear me reflect on how my ideas and practice have developed as a result of what we've done so far. So I know at every conference we go to as librarians, this raises its head. What is information literacy? And I am not going to go into this in vast amount of details, but I think it's important to lay out what my concept of information literacy was for this particular project. Now, I think we're all very used to the traditional skills models being used in information literacy, models, teaching, practice, especially in HE in the UK. So the predominant model, if you look at a lot of the literature on embedding information literacy, is the Sconnell 7 Pillars, or if you look at American practice, the ACRL threshold concepts as well. So these skills models exist and there's a lot of practice built upon them, But for me, information literacy is more than the library skills. And that's where these other critiques come in. And it's particularly true to say that a lot of the critique is that these skills models are HE centric, and that they don't think about what goes on beyond the university. Now, I know they consider transitions, but Anne-Marie Lloyd especially, she looks at the idea that people exist in landscapes of information, and that information literacy are fundamentally social construct. So people will come to university having experienced lots of other different landscapes of information. And they could be societal, they could be cultural, they could be personal to them, they could be political. They will link to their identity, will link to their history and their experiences. And so when people come to university, be it as staff or students, they're not a blank canvas through which you can just then start teaching these skills models. They come having experienced lots of other landscapes of information. And given that I was looking at first year modules, especially in this project, I really wanted to understand how far we were considering that this HE landscape in which students find themselves is an individual landscape amongst lots of others that they either have experienced or will be experiencing at the same time, or will be experiencing in the future. And do they see their experiences reflected in the information and the evaluation of that information that is presented to them in the HE environment? Taking that even further, looking at critical information literacy, of which Jim Elmborg is a key theorist, how do we help ourselves, our colleagues, and the students understand that no information comes to you in a neutral package? That everything behind information production and publication has some sort of power structure behind it, and that the evidence base that they're going to be asked to engage with at university is quite often centered from a privileged position due to the fact that other people have had their voices marginalized over the years. So I also wanted to think about how that was surfaced in the curriculum, or whether information and academic information was prescribed and came from a very particular viewpoint. So that's where I'm coming at with information literacy. I have to say that my understanding of this has developed massively over the years I've been doing this research project, over the last 5 years or so. It's developed much more critically. I am much more political in my view of information and resourcing and how it's used in universities. And I've also got much more bold, I guess, in debating this with colleagues. So I see that's part of my role now, especially when it comes to things like open access and access to information and the type of information that's employed in the curriculum. I think it's really important that we surface the power structures that go on behind that. And promote the agency of the student in that, and that they are an important agent in this research process. They should be centred in that. I could go on about this for much, much longer. I'll stop there because I could get on my soapbox and go on for much, much longer. But if you ever want to debate this or carry on that with me, more than happy to. So what I did was first of all, an investigation across the university and across the literature linked to the subjects and the programmes that we have here at the university about how information literacy may be expressed in the module documentation and in the practice of the colleagues that are teaching and designing the courses. So, for example, in the business school, there was a huge amount to do with knowledge management. There was a lot to do with reflective practice in the School of Education. There was a lot of evidence-based practice in the health school. So coming at these from their subject perspectives, the first thing I had to do was make sure that I was not employing the language of libraries in discussing this with the colleagues from across the university. So I looked at the journal literature, I looked at the professional literature from each of the different subject areas that we have in place here at the institution, and that was the language that I used when I was talking to the various representatives of the schools. We have nine academic schools here at York St currently, ranging from business through to performance, arts, and then things like education, health, social sciences. And each of them had a different perspective that they would be coming at this from. And I managed to get interviews with representatives from 8 of the 9 academic schools. The 9th academic school, interestingly, where I couldn't get an interview, has actually been investigated by one of my colleagues in more depth, because he was also interested in why they weren't engaging as much as the rest of the institution in this project. And so we have separate results for that school now that I can then feed into future developments with this project. But I got 8 of the 9 schools represented, and I interviewed module leaders and teachers who had taught on first-year modules where information literacy, I believed, had been expressed in the aims or the learning outcomes of the module, as I could see in the documentation on the virtual learning environment. I didn't want to impose my view too much upon them, so what I asked them to do was share their experiences of teaching and delivering and assessing those modules in respect to those learning outcomes that they had linked to information literacy. And just to give you a couple of examples of these learning outcomes or aims that I used, an example from the business school was a learning outcome of access information relevant to the study of business management and use appropriate referencing systems. So some clear linking to information use there. In the School of Education, the learning outcome was understanding what makes a good information source and how literacy contributes to the learning process. And we also had things like evaluate performances as visual and textual artifacts within historical and practice context, and that was from the School of Performance. So there were lots of different learning outcomes that I used as examples. And as I say, I asked the lecturers, the academics, the tutors from these modules to just share their experiences of delivering and assessing those with the students in the previous academic year. I did this a few months after the assessments had been done for these modules. And I used something called the critical incident technique to do that. If anyone's interested in finding out more about that, I can offer the original papers and some of my writing on that as well. So it was really trying to minimize my input into that. And from those interviews, I coded the responses. And across the board, there was common practice in what I would call traditional information literacy. So there was common practice across everything in all of the modules and the practice of all of the academics that linked to things like the traditional Sconal 7 pillars. So examples of directing students to search databases for information, thinking about referencing as a process that needed to be nailed down so that they were giving traditional and accurate references. So one example of a quote from that would be, we gave them instructions on how to find things in the library, journal articles and so on. Or another academic said they are set library tasks so they can go and find a piece of reading that relates to that, or to use the catalogue system, or to find something that's a hard copy of something. It was very much library skill based. And that was across all interviewees. But amongst that, there was also some evidence of what I would term the emerging information literacy in there too. And these were themed along the lines of the examples you can see on the screen there. So firstly, a couple of examples where the agency for the research process very much lay with the student. The student was given the agency to lead and control to some extent the research process that they were embarking upon. So something like, this came from one of the quotes, this is a quote from one of the interviewees. You've written a paraphrase. What gave you that idea? At some point you've read that, you've learned about that. So tell us how you've come to that conclusion. There was a colleague from the School of Humanities who said, what I wanted from them was to tell me their considered opinion based on other people's views of this topic. So it was this idea of academic voice coming through, that the student had some agency in there for controlling what they were doing. Going on from that, there was a consideration that the students' own unique information experiences and needs were addressed. So the idea that they didn't come to university as this blank canvas and they could just learn these skills and go through it in an iterative fashion and learn them and suddenly come out as researchers at the end of it. This idea that they have come with these experiences which will have moulded where they are so far. So there was one interviewee who said something along information anxiety lines. So there just seemed to be this sort of, I don't know what it is, panic about what it is. That sort of anxiety about the task that meant they weren't engaging well with the sources because something else was impacting on them. And another representative said, I am very aware that the students can have a massive amount of confidence with one part of a subject area, and usually the complete opposite when it comes to theory and writing and other kinds of knowledge. So they were thinking about the information that the students were using, but also their own experiences and emotions linked to that. Another theme that came out of this was the use of social and active learning, and this is very much linked to the idea of social construction of information, using peer support to evaluate resources so that maybe different perspectives and backgrounds are more represented in the classroom when they're evaluating topics. Something like, it's really discursive, so they are often having conversations across the room and in small groups and feeding back. And in another area, they actually got them to conduct a focus group so that they weren't just taking one perspective on board. All students got involved with group work. They've got that collaborative element where they can try to help one another, bounce ideas off one another. It provides a basis for them to open up, to get to know each other a little bit more on a personal level, aiding hopefully that transition into university life. So this was really the social side of it. And then finally, there was this key idea that the information landscape goes beyond academia and is more than the textual sources that a lot of people have come to rely on as academic. So in the School of Education, the tutor said, I gave them a breakdown that they had to have at least one piece of information from a union, from a teaching union, because I wanted them to evaluate that as an information source, whether it's politically linked, whether it was the voice of teachers, evidence-based, which some material is. I wanted them to use newspaper articles and think about the context of that and where it's positioning the debate in education. And there was also a lot of evidence of the information going beyond that traditional textual type in the School of Performance, where they were thinking about evaluating the performance that becomes more about trying to understand how performance sites historically, culturally, and geographically in a much wider context than the student may have expected. So this was evidence of sort of what I thought was much more emerging forms of information literacy, a much more pedagogically driven view of it, and having it already embedded in a lot of practice across the university. But I was well aware that these were only the representatives of the schools talking. It was just one voice from that school of tens, maybe hundreds of other academics. So from these interviews, I created a survey, and this survey went to every single academic who had taught on a level 4 module in York St John the previous academic year. It was still quite a small sample size because we're not a big university, but I sent this out across the institution to try and get some idea of how far I could extrapolate these individual experiences to the whole of the university. So I did that. I sent that out across the institution, and if anybody is interested in the content of that survey, I'm very happy to share that, certainly in its form, and I'm just coming to the end of analysing the results now. But it looked at learning outcomes, and it asked the tutors if they recognised learning outcomes from their own practice, and they were examples from both traditional and emerging information literacy. And it also looked at course design, and it looked at the individual practice of the academics as well. And it also followed the critical incident technique that I mentioned earlier. So I was asking them to reflect on their experiences of delivering those modules rather than telling me their views of information literacy outright. So that's what I did. And from this survey, there were some results that came out that have proved absolutely vital in the content of the resultant community of practice, and how we are going to progress it. So, like with the interviews, there was common practice in the more traditional forms of information skills, as in library skills, right across the institution. They replied with the learning outcomes very strongly, that they recognise this in their practice, and this is something that is going on across the institution. But beyond that, there were also pockets of practice of the emerging forms of information literacy, again, like we found in the interviews. And it's very much become my belief that I can use the traditional grounding as a basis to grow the more emerging forms and get that more embedded in the curriculum. So I don't think they are exclusive. I think I can grow from one to the other and get people together sharing practice and ideas so that we progress to the more progressive forms of information literacy. It's something I've come to believe very strongly as a result of this research. So the pockets of practice, what were they? Analysing the survey results, it became apparent that as I say, the traditional stuff is the most popular. So when I thought about example learning outcomes, the most popular one by far in the responses that tutors recognised in their practice was that they expected students to access information relevant to their subject and reference it accordingly. So those traditional academic skills of accessing information and then referencing it was the thing that was the strongest throughout. But there was also a very strong thread of being able to demonstrate personal responsibility with self-directed learning, which I felt leaned much more towards giving the students agency for their own research journey. So I think there was something there that we could build on as well. And also understanding the context and the audience when you are looking at information and also presenting it yourself. So there was some practice already there that considered the structures behind publishing and whose voice will be privileged when you are looking at what is termed academic information and where you might find information that isn't from those privileged voices, that isn't perhaps in the more formal traditional literature. So that was apparent there as well. I am not a statistician by any means, but I did undertake to do some modelling of the survey responses to see if there was anything statistically significant that I could use as the first step in the curriculum, the community of practice, to see if I should focus on specific areas first and where I might find people who are willing to share their experiences with that community that other people can either learn from, critique, and get the dialogue going. So I did some statistical modelling, and as I say, I'm not a statistician. It's the first time I've looked at statistics since I did A-level maths in 1997, and I can't see myself doing it in any great depth in the future, but it did lead to some really good information coming out of it. So in terms of the different academic schools, there was some practice that emerged as statistically significant. So what came out first was that my colleagues from the School of Business were much more likely than the rest of the institution to use learning outcomes and aims that are in line with the emerging forms of information literacy. So they are statistically significantly more likely to use the emerging forms of information literacy in their practice, linking to the learning outcomes we investigated. So I thought it'd be a really good idea to get people from the business school involved from the beginning and put forward some of their practice and ideas. The other group of people who came out as statistically more likely to use learning outcomes aligned with emerging forms of information literacy, thank goodness, were librarians. So I was relieved about that, that we are also employing these more emerging forms. Alongside this, my colleagues in the School of Education, they had statistically significant higher odds of integrating learning into professional or everyday life. So they were much more likely to be linking up academic practice with professional practice or personal information searching. Not unexpected, given they teach a professional course and the students are working on placement in schools and things like that as they go through their degree. But that came out as a significant finding. So again, I'd ask my colleagues from there to share their practice linked to that. When it comes to the more traditional practice, it was found that sports subjects were 8 times more likely as the rest of the sample to agree or strongly agree that students should use multiple sources to back up arguments. So they were quite progressive in that, but it was also a statistically significant outcome that they were more likely to have traditional learning outcomes. So that told me that they were sort of steering the students very much to the traditional literature, the traditional databases, journal articles, textbooks, but that once the students had found those results, they were then very much encouraging them to try and find multiple points of view in that, to try and find the different bits of evidence and argument that they could to form the assignment at the end of it. So that was quite an interesting finding from that perspective. And finally, the School of Education also had higher odds of contextualising information, so making it appropriate to context and audience. And again, given that they're dealing with school children a lot of the time in their professional practice, the students are both trainee teachers and students of a university. That was also not surprising, but it was good to find the statistics to back that up. So this helped form the basis of the community of practice. And finally, I am going to show you an example of what we've now drawn together as the community of practice. So what happened was I asked as one of the final survey questions if the tutors, the academics, the different professional support staff who'd received this survey would be interested in joining a community together to discuss these things more and help with curriculum design. And a lot of the respondents said they would. About 80% of the respondents gave me their contact details to say I'd be interested in this going forward. So that was really good. I had a core grouping that I could start with. And I also asked them if they would like face-to-face meetings, if they would like an online space, or if they would like both. And the response was that they'd like both. So they'd like synchronous communication in the form of regular face-to-face meetings, but they wanted some sort of platform that allowed asynchronous communication where they could find, discuss, look at other examples of practice. So that's what we've designed. And this is it. So this is my information in the curriculum website. It is built on a York St John WordPress blog. There are a few reasons for that. First of all, we were going to host it on a wiki, but then the platform we decided to use got discontinued. So we railed back on that idea. So what I decided was I needed something that I knew would be sustainable. I needed something that anybody could access because I didn't want it restricted to York St John current staff only. I wanted it to be available to prospective lecturers, people who were interested generally. I didn't want it locked down because some people had suggested we put it in the VLE and that would have locked it down, and that's not what I wanted. So the York St John instance of press just enabled me to have something that was open for everybody to use, but that still had some institutional link. And if that was ever discontinued, I could export it all and host it on a separate website myself if I needed to. So this is information in the curriculum, and it's got three main areas. First of all, I've given some background. So I went really quickly through information literacy and what it is. I've put some of the key models and theories up there so that anybody who is new to this, or if anyone hears us discussing something in a meeting and doesn't know what the context is, they have somewhere to go and find out more information. And this links out to other key resources on those topics. So I've got the ANTSIL curriculum from Jane Secker and Emma Coonan as something that's very HE based, that they can get a handle on for the basics. And then I've moved into Anne-Marie Lloyd's Information Landscapes here, and then Elmborg's Critical Information Literacy here as well. I've got a record of face-to-face meeting and discussions here. So it was decided that we would try and have at least one meeting each semester, so 2 meetings a year. That seems to have gone quite well. We get a few people turning up to the meetings. We theme the meetings, so coming up we'll discuss induction. We've had dissertation sessions as a theme. So we're trying to give them some sort of focus when we're there, and we advertise them across the all staff emails here at York St John, and I promote them on Twitter and things to my colleagues who follow me there. So that's the face-to-face meetings, but all of those meetings and discussions are also minuted, and we put notes of those discussions in the share and discuss area, which is the final key area of the platform, and this is where the things tend to take place. So as you can see, we've got the discussion we took place last month and what we discussed there. We've got different examples of people's practice. So a couple of these come from my academic liaison colleagues. They've put these up there. And there's also an opportunity for anybody to submit content if they wish. Now, this hasn't worked as well as I'd hoped. What tends to happen is that people email me and ask me to post them as facilitator, and that's fine. But I did want there to be some way that someone could post content themselves, and then I just facilitate it in the sense of I check it's not a spam submission. I assign tags and categories so that they're easily findable later, and then I post it. So I try not to edit what people have submitted. And as a result of this, a couple of really exciting projects have come out of this. One of them is as a result of a presentation I gave about the work I've been doing in our parallel and linked meetings that go on campus of people who are interested in pedagogic research. And actually, I can see going forward that we might merge the work of this community of practice with my pedagogic research and practice colleagues to see if we can progress this together and have shared practice going on there. But that's for the future consideration. Anyway, I gave a presentation about my research to the pedagogic research group here at York St John. And as a result of that, a colleague came forward and said she was really interested in designing a session with me on how reading list design has been influenced by power structures for her students who were doing a module on voice and participation. And so that's what we did. You can read about it more on the blog if you're interested in it. But basically, we designed a workshop where it just got the students to think about whose voices had been privileged when they were exploring educational concepts. In terms of people of colour, in terms of disability, in terms of LGBTQI+, women, lots of different perspectives. We just highlighted how people might not be represented and why, and gave them some further reading to do if they were interested in pursuing that further, and got them debating it. So this was the first time we run anything like that, and I documented my thoughts and reflections on that on the site. And this was a really worthwhile thing I think we did. It's very much a small thing to do and the start of something to do, but it's the beginnings of critically analysing the content of the resources that we have and helping the students understand the politics and the structures behind information. As a result of this, and again that meeting, another colleague contacted me, this time from the School of Social Sciences, from criminology, and that's a course I don't work with at all on a day-to-day basis. And as a result of hearing about this workshop that we've done in education, she is now at the end of the first phase of a research project on analysing the curriculum here at York St John for marginalised voices, with a view to surfacing and amplifying those voices in the criminology curriculum here, which is brilliant, and I'm getting involved with that later on this year. So look out for that coming on my Twitter feed and again on the blog as well. So there have been practical outcomes that I can see already, and I think they will help to transform curriculum design linked to information literacy with a much more critical lens on it. So I think the thing I want to sort of round this up with at the end of this presentation is that we talk a lot about information literacy in HE, and it's generally to do with the students' information literacy. And I think understanding the needs of academics in terms of information literacy is something that is lacking. And understanding how we can work with academics to learn from each other in terms of pedagogy and information literacy is something that's really worth exploring. Because I think to sustain information literacy and get it embedded in the curriculum long term, we have to look at curriculum design and how we work with our academic colleagues on that, rather than just focusing on the students. The students are really important, and I don't see my interactions with them ever diminishing. But I find it really vital that we work from now on in with academic colleagues and understand that they appreciate the time and effort we can put into collaborating with them when they're designing the curriculum, and that can help with the eventual manifestations of information literacy in course design, in learning outcomes and in assessment practices as well. Okay, I think I shall leave it there. I have skipped over what communities of practice are. I'm very aware of that. If you want to know more about those, please let me know. And if you would like to discuss any of the findings in more depth with me, please also contact me, because I would be very happy to do so. There are my references, because I'm a good librarian, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now in the 10 minutes or so we have left.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was a very strong message to finish the presentation, understanding how we can work together in partnership with academics to develop pedagogy and information literacy embedded within the curriculum. I think this is more or less what we are really trying to achieve with our online community as well. So I'd like to thank you for this very important message that you gave today. Okay, so do we have any questions from the audience at this point? Okay, we do have a question. Okay, Claire, are you able to see the questions?
The question about Wenger, yeah?
Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah. Yes.
Should I read it out? I know Wenger quite well, but were there any other writers that inform your perspective on communities of practice, particularly in relation to information literacy? Over to you, Claire.
Right. Well, Wenger was the core theorist that I went with. And for those who aren't familiar with Wenger's work, he talks about the fact that communities are situated in a particular workplace or environment, and that there's often a lot of shared practice that goes on that can be facilitated and built upon. So he was the theorist that I worked with the most on that. But there are some examples of specific communities of practice in information literacy linked to Venga that I can add to the information on the slides when we share them later, where people have used those in practice. But there were no other theorists really that I looked at apart from the ones that had looked at Venga with communities of practice.
Okay, thank you, Claire. We have a question from Andrew. So Claire, going back to working with academics on diversifying reading lists, which approaches, arguments in favor of that were they most receptive to?
The approach that I found worked the best I have to say, it comes with the people who are interested in voice as academic concern anyway. They were very receptive to the idea of how you can introduce other forms of literature or other types of resources that in some cases complemented the academic literature that they'd already established, but in other cases could replace it, in terms of providing different types of resource, so video, documentary evidence, blog evidence, things like that. That was an approach that seems to work quite well. If I can go with some examples that align with the concerns that they're looking at, but bring a new voice to it, that's been the thing that has worked the best in my experience. But I do have to say it will vary a lot according to the subject areas you're looking at and the ways in which information is viewed in that area.
Okay, thank you very much for this answer. Kirsten, you're saying that you would love to get a look at the draft survey that was sent to academics as part of the research. Are you able to share that with Kirsten, Claire?
I can definitely share the survey. What I might do is create a document from it and put it on the community of practice so that anybody can access it. So I will let everybody know when I've done that. It'll be towards the end of this week. I'll do that for you.
Okay, excellent. Can I ask you a question, Claire? Are you planning to develop the community of practice as something that can be used widely by other academics beyond the university where you're currently working?
I hope so. I mean, it is at heart something that is for use in practice here because that's what it's been designed upon, but I would be more than happy if this was picked up and used in other institutions or in other sectors. I think there's a way that we could link other practice-based resources up. I think we could share across different institutions, no problem, and I think that would only enrich what we've got available already.
Okay, that's very interesting because I was interested in the way in which other people decided to email you instead of post, and I thought, okay, that reminds me of something that it's quite difficult to get people to participate online, I find. So it would be interesting to see how this could be enabled, and especially as a community of practice is something that is more organic, and it probably creates itself in a way, emerges on its own somehow.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, do we have any more questions? I see some people are asking for a certificate of attendance, which we can easily provide. Please, if you don't mind, email me so that I can get your personal email. I can email you back. We have another question. You mentioned that your questionnaire was born out of the results of your interviews. Did you plan on taking a mixed methodology from the start, or did your project evolve that way, Claire?
It was planned from the start to use a mixed methodology. It was always intended that we would design a survey based on interviews, so we designed it from the beginning that way. Lots of different reasons. It's a practitioner research and action research project where I'm looking at my own practice, and so I wanted the research methods that we used within that to be as robust as possible and to bring in as many different perspectives as possible. So that's why we went with mixed methods. It's a really good pragmatic approach within the action research methodology to make sure that I was hopefully getting the voice through of as many people as possible.
Very good, thank you. Okay, fantastic. Thank you for all these questions. And in the future, we can also use microphones and cameras. I know that might be too much for now, but once we have done more of these webinars, we could have a bit more interactivity here. Any more questions at all for Claire? No? Okay. So, yes, okay. How has it influenced your own teaching sessions? I know you do a lot. Okay.
Yes, I do. It's influenced the way I approach them, definitely. I give a lot more thought to ensuring that there is the opportunity for students' own experience and priorities and voice to come through. And that might not be through sort of traditional group talking activities. I'm aware that that can marginalize some people sometimes. So I definitely mix up the content of my sessions a lot more now. There's the opportunity for things like online participation that's anonymized for people to be able to put forward their ideas. There's a lot more consideration and critique of resource types and resource origin than there used to be. So we focus a lot on whose voice is coming through here and what might be a way of either counteracting that or supporting that as necessary. So I think I used to be, if I look back on it, very much the demo and then try out kind of session a lot. And that was often led by the academic. That's what they wanted. They wanted me to go in and demo a tool and then get students using it. But it's definitely much more led now by why are we doing this? What are we going to find? And how else can we find things that on this topic where we might be finding resources that are not represented here, and getting the students' own view through more.
Yes, that's definitely. And I was very interested to hear the differentiation between traditional and emerging information literacy, Claire. And you talked about privileged voices, formal traditional voices, as opposed to the voices that are underrepresented. And this idea of, in some of the schools, steering the students towards the traditional views, but also allowing multiple points of view to emerge. So I think that's quite important, and a very worthwhile discussion that we need to start in terms of allowing the students to actually be more involved in development of information literacy and all these marginalized voices to actually come through as well. Okay, Joanna, you're typing. Thank you. You're doing what many of us have as goals. Okay, it is so hard to get out of the demo mode. Okay, thank you. Thank you for all these interesting questions, and thank you for attending our webinar. We are a new community, so we really appreciate your participation and involvement. The only thing we have to say is until next time, we hope to see you again. We are planning to organize other events. At the moment, we are planning a Twitter chat session for October to celebrate the UNESCO Digital Media Literacy Week. But if you have any ideas you would like to present and your own perspective, the community is open. That's the point of view. So please get in touch with me, and I'm always happy to organize something to engage the other participants. So that's all the time we had for today. And now we are going to stop the recording, and thank you again very, very much for taking part. So thank you, and see you again.